To start the video off, I'm going to go over the individual assets and then cover the source creation. Timestamps are going to be added below, so if there's something specific that you'd like to see, feel free to skip around. And to start, I'm going to play both transient layers together. Now we're going to hear the first layer soloed up by itself. So the thing here is both the attack and the release are set to 0 milliseconds, which creates this artificial transient. And I wanted that alongside this timbre that's created by the other oscillators and noise oscillator. To process the sound, I'm using 2 multi-band compressors inside a serum. Then I'm taking out some of the low end with EQ. Saturation is being used just to try to tame some of the harshness of the sound. Finally, for this chain, everything is being sent through a clipper, and the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to take that artificial click that I'm creating and some of the timbre of the oscillators and blend the two elements together. And then this is the second transient layer soloed up. So for this layer, all it is a patch that I've made inside of Kick 2 where I'm just giving myself transient information. And I do this in a bunch of different designs where I want something to hit, or if I want to leave a point of reference for a sound that I want to be very impactful. I have a bunch of these little transients that I'll lay in different places and then address them later. For this specific element, because it's so short, it sounds kind of anemic on its own and gets buried, but I want it to really punch and hit, so I'm using clipping to try to bring some of that out. So I'm going to play it real quick again with the clipper on and then with it off. Now with it off. To me, the clip-in is making the sound very front and center, and that's exactly what I want for the first initial part of this gunshot. So this is the style and body layer of my sound, so this is where a lot of the character lives. And to start, here's what everything sounds like soloed up. The first layer here is actually the last one that I added to this section. And all I'm doing here is adding some white noise to kind of give some top end sheen and some energy to the sound that was missing. The second layer here is a bass patch that I created in Serum. So this element's going to show up later when the shot sustains and slowly rises. To start the processing, I took out some of the low end, and then I'm throwing it through a clipper and a limiter. The next layer is created with Kick 2, and all I'm trying to do is get this resonance sort of zap. And now here's what it sounds like in context with the other sounds. Even though it's subtle, I did like the character that it was adding to the sound. And to process this, I added an EQ that took out some of the low end to avoid any mud or buildup, and then I put a clipper at then as a safety to catch any peaks. This next layer I think adds a really cool sort of tactile feel to the design, and all it is a like percussive sound that I created in Serum using the noise oscillator. To me, this layer is really important because I wanted to create an element that the listener can kind of focus on with their ears just subconsciously while I sort of expand the stereo image around them. And I really thought that'd be an interesting way to create a scene change where you feel like the energy is starting to build up in the weapon. On to the next layer. So this is a glass recording from a sample library, and what I've done is I've taken it and stretched it, and the mode that I'm using is the re mode. I'll talk a bit more about this in the source creation section, but it's also important to know that this is an element that's going to appear in the sustain part of the shot as well. For the processing, the original sample was in mono, so I'm using ensemble to sort of spread it out. And then since every sound is slightly different, I'm using the audio follower to then affect the pitch, so I get variations. And then I'm taking out some of the low end, and everything is going through a limiter to just catch some of the peaks. Here's the next layer. This is just some source that I created that I thought added some really cool sort of like stereo effect to the sound, but I'll show this later in the source creation phase. Here's the next sound. Once again, I'll talk about the chain for this later on in the video, but just to showcase like what I'm doing here with the processing, it's doing the same trick with the audio follower to create variations in pitch. Just because I found that the chain that I was using sort of popped out a bunch of sounds that were very similar, with very minimal things that I could change about it. And now for the final texture. This is part of that same glass sample, it's just lower in pitch, and I'm using it as a way to sort of blend into the sustained part of the shot. And I forgot to mention, but the reason why I'm using glass is because there's a part of this weapon that's sort of spinning around and it looks like it's made out of glass, and so this is my way to represent that element of the gun. So originally I didn't want to add some sort of tail layer to the gun because I wanted it to seem sort of odd or foreign. But I kind of did that without noticing in the effects bus, which is turned off right now. And if I wanted to turn this into an asset for a game, I would just print out like some of the echoes and stuff and make it a part of the shot. For the final sound, I'm using Kick 2 to create a sublayer, and with this, I wanted to draw in some sort of envelope that made the sound feel like it was bouncing. And I didn't mind the real resonant like transient at the beginning of the sound either. And as you can see, the only other thing I have on here is a clipper, but it's not really even doing anything because I turned it down minus 6 dB. So here's the first layer for the sustained fire mode. So this is supposed to represent the heat or the burning aspect of the laser gun that, like, if it touches something, it sort of sets it on fire. And this is built off a serum patch that I made. It's a simple patch with two oscillators that I chose just because of their timbre, and then I'm just having them rise in pitch. I'm using a lot of harsh limiting and Soothe 2 to sort of tame the sound and bring it to a place where I can sculpt it with EQ at the end. Here's the second layer. This is that percussive patch that I made in Serum, and once again, it's just used as an anchor for the listener while things around them change, and I'm just adding some EQ to sort of have it fit within these other layers. This next layer here represents the sub layer. This is a simple patch where it's just a wavetable that's pitched down low and then being pitched up slowly over time. And I'm moving the wavetable position, but I think the interesting part here is how I'm using the LFO to sort of trigger the sound and give it this like bounce. The reason for doing this is I wanted to sort of pull the listener in and then release as the shot builds. And for reference, I'm going to play it alongside everything else so you can hear it in context. The main part about this that was really important to me was just how it made me feel as the listener, and it added to the scene change that I was trying to create. The first plugin that I have to process the sound is Recenter, but this isn't important because the sound's already in mono. Here I'm carving out some low end so the initial part of the shot doesn't sort of conflict with the sub layer from the single fire mode. And then finally, I have a limiter where I'm pinning it because I want to keep some sort of consistent aspect of the sound over time, even if I change it later on. Now for the next layer. So this patch is sort of derived from the sub layer that I just showed, but I turned it into more of a respace so I could keep some continuity and make the bass feel like it was sort of opening up and spread into the sides, even though it's really just a different patch. With this EQ, I've let in a little bit more of the low end information just because as the shot rises, there's nothing really competing with it. And then I'm using a limiter to pin it. And then this filter is allowing me to bring the higher frequencies in. And then I'm also taking the low frequencies out to make room for that sort of exertion of energy at the end that says that the gun is done. Here's the next layer that slowly builds up. Here's the patch that I made, and all it's doing is using some source that I created in my design session, and then I'm using Serum's granular sampler to gain control of the sound. To make it sound a bit more chaotic, I'm using Pan-Man to sort of pan it quickly left and right. Then I'm using an EQ to take out some of the low end, and I'm using Soothe to tame any high resonant frequencies that are really annoying. And then the rest of the chain is just using limiting to pull out more of the body while removing some of the low end. Another thing is I'm doing manual automation of the width of the sound, so that way as the sound rises, it slowly starts to close the stereo image and make room for other sounds. Finally, I have these two bits of glass recordings that I manipulated, and all it's doing is acting as a transition between the shot and the sustained part, and then leaving the gun. It's really just for continuity. Another aspect of the sustained fire was I had this effects bus where I was sending the entire gunshot through it and then affecting it over time. This could be printed as a tail. I just left it like this for the sake of the design, but if it was going to be an asset in game, similar to the tails, if I was going to use those in the game, I would just print this and then send them to something else. All this is supermassive being automated, and I thought it helped represent that aspect of time that I wanted to get into the design. An aspect of the gun that I thought would be pretty interesting to cover is this little piece of glass that lives in the middle here, and it sort of rotates and spins around as the gun's being shown. So I wanted to represent that in some capacity. So I created this idle noise for it. So this is the same bit of design glass material that I'm using, and then I put it through a limiter, dual delay to get it to kind of move, and then I'm using soothe to tame any high resonant frequencies. I knew for this gun I wanted to have some sort of like stylized reload, and I'm using source material that I created for the sustain part of the shot. And once again, this is done to keep continuity between the different parts. All the pieces are chopped up and then affected separately to create variation. A majority of the processing that was done on these tracks is really just EQ to get some different changes in the timbre. At the end of the reload, I took this one bit of source and I pitched it up and added some tremolo to sort of give this satisfying end to the gun reload. And here's what the other layers sound like. And then here's the last sound that has that sci-fi element. This is the chain that I used to kind of create this source. It's just a bunch of ensemble to sort of smear the sound. And then I'm using EQ to take out some of the mud as I push into different things. A lot of what this sort of chain produced was very limited, I feel. The only thing that helped create slight variation was the input, obviously, that went into it. But what I did afterwards I took it and I threw it through a bunch of different processing to create variation and build up the palette. I'm honestly just going to skip over the Foley because it's like a sample of some cloth and stuff that just represents the character holding the gun. Instead, I'm going to just move on to the mechanical bits. I'm going to quickly just play through everything because I think talking about this in the source design section is going to be a lot more useful. But everything's separated here into like the different sources. And that last one there with the sub is really just to emphasize the force that the character's pulling the clip out of the gun with and also putting it back into the gun. Here's a quick listen to all the parts together again. So now I'm going to look at how I created the source for the design. I've organized everything here, but normally when I'm going through this and trying to experiment, it looks a lot more chaotic. So this is a basic gist of what everything I used was. So I'm not really doing this in any particular order, but this first example here is going to be how I created some of the weird movement in the gun reload section to sort of fit that like alien sci-fi material. And on its own, it doesn't really sound crazy, but like when you bounce this out and throw it into like a granular sampler, like for me, I was using Serum, you can sort of stretch the palette of sounds that you create and build more material to work off of. And once I sort of had the basis for this, I threw it through Traveler and created impacts and things like that to use around the design. This next bit is what I was using to represent that middle piece of the gun that has the glass that spins. I took this material and I reversed it and it sounded really cool for a bunch of different parts of the gun. And then after I had that, I took this sample and I pitched it up and down and created a bunch of different source, and here's what I came up with. To get this to fit as a layer in the single fire part of the gun, I took it and threw it through Traveler and created a bunch of different impacts, but I'm using limiting to sort of pin the sound and create like some sort of unified amplitude for the signal. So everything's going through a limiter to slam it, and then that's being run through Absent 5, and I'm using its effects processing to do some frequency shifting. You can mess around with these different settings if you want, because they all lead to a different result, obviously, but the frequency shifting is helping me generate some high frequency content. For reference, here's what it sounds like without the frequency shifter. And here's what's being added. The next plugin that I'm adding is dual delay to give it some movement. So it's adding a bit of width to the sound, and I'm also using Convolver afterwards, and this is kind of subtle in the mix. And for reference, here's no Convolver. And then up next is the RX Deverb for some weird movement. It's really just the fact that it has like irregular like patterns in its ducking that I thought it created an interesting addition to this texture. And then I'm using Recenter to sort of focus the stereo image since I have Convolver and dual delay and stuff like that on. And then after that, everything was kind of turned into an impact using Traveler, so I'm going to show some of the source for that. And then afterwards, I'm using a limiter to sort of push the sound, and then using declip to get some like weird artificial textures. And once that last batch processing was done, I threw it through some spectral denoise because it was pulling out textures that I really liked. I think what I liked about what I was hearing here is that when I had slammed the sound with a limiter and then used declip, I think what happened was spectral denoise kind of showed a lot of that high-end texture that was in the quiet bits that were brought up. And then to tame some of that, I'm using Soothe, and a limiter is being put at the end as a safety again. And then this was the final bit of source I created. This next part represents the burn-in aspect or the heat aspect of the laser. And this is actually the same patch, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. The only difference is Traveler is being put on here to create single impact versions of it, and then limiters are once again trying to create a unified source. This next layer is just one of those sustained shots turned into impacts again, but here's what it sounds like. This next layer is that snap heap chain that I created, and I'm sending small bits of the glass material through it to create this like big sci-fi like wide sound. And for reference, here's what this is like without the chain. And then to quickly break down this chain, I'm starting with a limiter to sort of flatten out the signal and make it even. After that, I'm using Soothe to tame any harsh resonances, and then another layer of L2. It's not really doing anything, but just as a force of habit, I kind of just put them on so I don't clip. And then After that, I'm going into K-Clip and I'm going to be slamming this pretty hard. I just like the way it sounded. And then to go into the snap peep chain that I have at the end, I'm using R-Bass to push into it to have it kind of react differently. And to compare what it sounds like before and after, I'm going to play it without the R-Bass right now. And here's what it sounds like with the plugins turned on. It's really subtle, but I think it just helps this sort of chain grab onto the sound in a different way. So the next layer is the reverse glass turned into impacts. The chain for this is very simple. I'm using Traveler to create the impacts, but then R-Bass is helping push into the Transient shaper and make it grab the sound in a certain way that I like. Here's what the source sounds like without the chain on. Now here's with the chain. I wanted to show off this Sci-Fi Chain once again. I'm going to just run some different types of source through it so you can see what I was talking about with how it kind of grabs onto different sounds or different textures that are being fed through it. So instead of just using this as is, like I mentioned, I sort of expanded on this idea and I took the source material that was generated by this and I stretched it and then added more processing on top. Here's what it sounds like without the chain. Now I'm going to go over the processing for that, and on this snap peep chain, what I'm doing is I'm using Convolver, and I'm sort of using this to smooth out the sound and make it a bit like wider. And then I'm using a pitch shifter with audio follower on it, so that way I can have like different fluctuations in pitch and kind of create variation in the sound. And at the very end, it's just ensemble to spread out the sound a bit more and a limiter to catch any peaks. Now I'm going to play the final render. Out of that stretch sample source I showed at the very beginning, I took those metal bits that I pulled apart, I rendered them, and I started to throw them through different effects. The main thing that I'm using is the granular sampler because it's helping me kind of stretch the source and kind of twist it and turn it into different things for me to use. A lot of the chain is just to create these like impacts. In contrast to the Cyberpunk gun that I did, this gun didn't really seem like it had a lot of mechanical parts moving like under the hood. So everything I did here was just to have like very direct impacts. And then in order to add some sort of movement to stylize it, that's what all the sci-fi effects that I put on top were. In order to kind of gain control of like how I wanted this whole thing to play out, I created MIDI notes and I just put it where the reload animations were happening. And I used different bits of source alongside the ones that I created. So I used traditional just reload sounds and I started throwing it in there and I threw any sort of mechanical bit I could. And the reason why I did this is because I thought it would sound weird if I started pulling from all sorts of places. And that's kind of what I wanted for this like alien sort of weapon. And to kind of get an idea for what this process sounded like, I'm going to just play it with the MIDI markers. The sound here doesn't matter because like I just threw a bunch of different stuff in, but just have a listen. So this process to me is really nice because I get an idea of what I'm trying to achieve, and it also shows me possibilities through happy accidents. And just to hear the variety of source I was able to create, I'm going to play through some of these different examples here. And there's a lot more source I was able to generate through this as well, but this is just a small snippet of like what was possible. And then alongside this, I also had some traditional gun recordings that I just used a transient shaper into a clipper to create. And this is what that chain looked like. And then another thing I did to generate some more content for the granular sampler chain that I had, I recorded some stuff around the house. So I did like a coffee machine, air fryer, all that sort of stuff. So that's it for the breakdown. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed the video, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. I'm going to try to get some more videos out, depending on what I put out next. So keep on a lookout for that. Thanks for watching.